So what did you make of the deal?
What did I make the deal? Well, first of all, Nvidia's earnings are tomorrow, and so I thought maybe today would be quiet. But I think I've learned a lesson, which is there's lots of news today because I think everyone wanted to get their news out ahead of Nvidia's earnings. Um, Bright and early, we found out about AMD and Meta, and I think good. It's good for both of them. Meta's been talking recently, and honestly for a long time, that they are going to spend more and more capex because they need more and more compute to drive their advertising-based business, which uses lots of AI. We know that that involves Nvidia. We know it involves their MTIA custom silicon, but of course, they've long been partners with AMD, and this was a big announcement about really Meta and AMD co-designing chips and systems together, and sort of like aligning their incentives such that this will be a long-term partnership for many generations. And I think it's win-win for both sides.
Now, I want you to help us put this into context of all of the deals that Meta is signing. So we saw the Nvidia deal. We also did some reporting on Meta's potential deal with Google to sign a contract to get their TPUs. I mean, is is this sort of par for the course now in terms of companies spreading their bets and hedging their bets, or is there anything unique about what Meta is doing?
Yeah, there's a lot going on here. So at the end of the day, there we know that there's a ton of demand for compute for Meta to improve their business. They need all sorts of AI compute. On the other end of the spectrum, from a supply perspective, TSMC makes all that compute. And so there is a lot of thinking going on in between that spectrum of how do we get access to as many chips as possible. There's lots of companies that have agreements with TSMC for wafers, and Meta is working with all of them to really just get us access to as much compute as possible. Now, there are trade offs, of course. You have to write software that works on all these different systems, but clearly, Meta is comfortable with this idea of having a portfolio of different compute offerings from different companies, and they're figuring out how to make their workloads work across them.
Have you done any analysis or have you thought at all about what the cost of 6 gigawatts of compute would be? And the way I'm sort of thinking about this as well is, okay, Meta is getting a certain portion of AMD shares in exchange for this arrangement. Does that kind of offset the cost at all? Is it getting something in return? How do you think about that?
Yeah, yeah. So AMD said this is tens of billions of dollars of revenue per gigawatt. If you crunch the numbers, and if you're just looking at like, if you think about these warrants ultimately as sort of a discount, you could say, okay, well, how much of the company is Meta getting in return? How much is that worth? And what is sort of the discount off the price of the chips? On the call this morning, Lisa pushed back on that thinking, saying, hey, that's too narrow minded. The goal isn't to extract as much revenue from Meta today as possible. The goal is to really co design and develop, and for AMD to really win with Meta as a first big best customer. They're also doing this with OpenAI. And that AMD will benefit that from that in the long run and sort of capture that value later with all the other customers. So think about it as um, all of AMD's potential customers looking and saying, wow, OpenAI is deploying a lot of AMD, Meta's deploying a lot of AMD. AMD's learning a ton by working with these big best customers and developing future generations. I feel pretty confident. Maybe I should look at AMD as a potential offering.
So it's almost like having these giant deals and having these giant customers will allow AMD to really experiment. And we've talked on this show about how we talked about it in the context of Nvidia, but it's hard to anticipate all the challenges that will come up when you have these large scale implementations. And there's only a couple of the biggest clients to go around. And so what I hear you saying is AMD gets this deal with Meta. They get to deploy their chips at scale. They get to learn from that. That could actually help them develop further chips down the line.
Yes, exactly. It's, can we get a few of those customers, deploy our chips in production at the biggest scale possible, and learn as rapidly from that? So you're exactly right. They're basically getting permission to run at scale and to learn quickly and to grow from there.
Now, Austin, does this leave any room for startups in the chip sector, or not even startups, but smaller chip companies? I mean, we see the big deals between the hyperscalers and the Metas of the world, and then the Nvidias, the AMDs. I mean, this is really turning into just the big getting bigger in some ways, right?
It is, and it's nuanced, but there's definitely still room for startups. So, what the framing for what's happening today is AMD said we're going to make a custom variant of our GPU specifically tuned to Meta's workloads. And that's actually along the spectrum of where other startups are trying to play ball, whether, Cerebras, Grok have been in the news recently. But then even today, we saw MadX raised money, Samba Nova raised money, recently Etched has raised money. And the all of everyone is counter positioning and saying, "Hey, we are best for certain workloads, for certain sort of KPIs or metrics that you're tracking, whether that's ultra low latency or ultra high throughput or ultra low cost." And so now this is AMD has historically been focused on GPUs that are more flexible, and you just basically get what you get. It's got this much HBM, this much compute, and that's what you get. What AMD is doing is saying, hey, we can actually tune these systems to your workloads. So they have this idea of chiplets, which are like Lego blocks. Maybe Meta's particular workload needs a little bit less compute or a little bit more memory, and so they are starting to move down that spectrum away from just you get the particular SKU off the shelf, MI450X, to now like, oh, we're going to tune that a little bit for your workloads. That does encroach a little bit on startups who are already saying, well, we'll build custom chips that are very hyper tuned to your specific metrics that you care about. And so it definitely is the big kind of encroaching on that. But I think what we're seeing with generative AI is there are all sorts of workloads from real-time voice to video generation to frontier models. And so there'll continue to be different workload demands from chips. And I think there will still be opportunities for startups to come in and really hyper focus on a specific niche, if you will.
So we saw the OpenAI deal, we saw the Meta deal. Who do you think could be next to sign one of these giant deals for AMD? Who are you watching?
Mm. So this is all about AI labs running inference at scale. Meta, we saw OpenAI. It begs the question, could Anthropic be next? Obviously, Anthropic's working closely with Amazon on the Trainium, but everyone wants more compute. So that's what I'd be watching is, will we hear something similar from Anthropic with AMD? AMD did say there's more strategic partnerships coming. So that's what I'd be listening for.
Great. Well, Austin, I want to thank you for coming on. That is Austin Lyons, a senior analyst at Creative Strategies here on TI TV.